Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth lecture of our lecture series this fall. Today we have a really exciting, a very special lecture by Karima Bembi. We're gonna have Barry Interim, our new assistant professor, which is super exciting. Introduce her in a minute, but I just wanted to let you know that this is the last lecture of the series. We're gonna continue with that during the spring. We will have new speakers. We are lining up also a really exciting group of people coming from all over the U.S. and even other places. And I'm sure it will be great. Today's lecture, as I said, is special because he's not. Karima is an architect by education, but she's not going to really talk about her own architectural projects. So she's going to talk us about her experience working in the World Bank and his ideas and her research that has helped the work there. So, Berin, can you introduce her more in detail? Yeah. Thanks, Berin, by the way, Berin was the person that actually brought her here, and it's been a great opportunity.
Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth and last lecture of the fall series of the lecture series. As you know, this year the theme is Healing Environments, Architectures and Landscapes After the Crisis. The moment we actually heard this theme for the lecture series, Karima was the first person that came to my mind. We go far back. Actually, our friendship is like a decade now. We were kind of marking that. Okay, sorry about that. But we met in the PhD program. We went to the same PhD program, and when she was in the PhD program, she was kind of talking about her research that actually is really related to the reconstruction after crisis. And she actually has done all of her research on this. And I was like, okay, but how is that happening? Like, what is your angle? Like, do you want to go to academia? Do you want to actually teach? Do you want to practice? Like, what is this research going to take you? And she was like, from day first, very adamant and clear about the fact that, all the policymakers who are up there and actually allocating the monies and allocating all of the resources in World Bank, in United Nations, in EU, all of that, they have no design background, and those are the ones who are making decisions. So I have a design background, I'm an architect, and I want to enter this field just to tell them how is actually things are supposed to be done correctly. So today I have the honor of introducing Karima, who works as an urban and disaster risk management specialist and task team leader at the World Bank Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practice. Based in Washington, D.C., she focuses on the Middle East and North Africa, and with an emphasis on post-conflict urban recovery and reconstruction, the disaster risk management, low-income housing, and local economic development. Karima holds a PhD in architecture and urban studies, focusing on the post-disaster reconstruction of dense agglomerations from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and an MArch focusing on post-disaster shelter design from l'École Nationale d'Architecture de Rabat. Before joining the World Bank, she worked for over 10 years in the private sector and with international NGOs and international organizations on housing policy, urban disaster risk management, and urban planning. So please welcome Karima with me.
Thank you both for the introduction. I feel like my presentation was already made because that's what I was going to talk about the importance of us designers being in the room when decisions are being made after disasters. The presentation today is going to depart a little bit from the previous ones in the series. So from my understanding, you had the opportunity to listen to some of the leading designers in the field of architecture that showed you the built production and the process by which the design process that's leading to them. So I just want to say that there won't be any beautiful designs in my presentation, quite the contrary, unfortunately, but just bear that in mind. But I want to take you in sort of a tour around the world and provide the bird's eye view on urban reconstruction. It's a very important topic And it's gonna be more and more important because of different issues, including climate change, including lots of different wars and conflicts that are rising left and right globally. But I also wanna kind of highlight very briefly and very quickly, this is a topic that could be discussed for hours, why it is important to talk about reconstruction, particularly in urban areas, particularly the architectural inputs in reconstruction, why it is important, why it is difficult to do, and all it takes for the architectural acts to be allowed to happen. And that's why I decided to go the policy route rather than design route. So more specifically, what I want to talk about is one, the architect's role in, and why it is so critical right after disasters or right after crises, and why it is often very much overshadowed because of economies of humanitarian aid, international development in global contexts, but also just kind of the development mindset, even locally in the US. And New Orleans is a good example after Sandy, and we can discuss about that at a later stage. But when you think about the people that moved away from New Orleans and the people who actually came back, there's a huge discrepancy, and the rehabilitation and the reconstruction kind of missed the point a lot in terms of really capturing some of the culture that was there and how to invite people to be able to come back. And then I want to talk a little bit about a brief history of a group of architects that actually helped shape the urban scapes after a major event, which was World War II. And then I want to talk about two recent examples of post-crisis response and recovery that I've been involved in, and present where the efforts lie now and why and how long it takes and how difficult it is to actually really get to the point where architecture is being made. And these two examples are Beirut, Lebanon, and Ukraine. And I understand there's a faculty member here that is from Lebanon, so just...
Yes, that's me.
Hi. Oh, we were waiting for you. I'm just joking. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about myself, but I think I'm going to skip it. Skip kind of the introductions because I think Berin did a good job, but I did spend the better part of my career really thinking about this topic. At the beginning, I thought of it from, how do we move slides here? Okay. I thought of it from from a shelter perspective, a shelter design. This is my undergrad design, so it's, don't critique. The interest was really trying to think about following the 2004 Aceh tsunami and kind of like following disasters, trying to think a little bit about design of shelters, efficiency requirements, but also trying to think about beauty, elegance, and design because they don't seem to have any space and they don't make the cut when we talk about emergency. But more specifically, when I started thinking a little bit about kind of how the shelter is one of the first spaces where the sense and the predisposition of one's place is recovered and is therefore the first site where you reconstruct your own identity as a person that just went through a traumatic event of a disaster or a war. And then the habitus, which is the social construct of oneself within our own society, of community, where all of these elements start, and it shapes the rebuilding of the actual site, of the built environment, but also the city and the systems around it. How can we do that from a shelter a tent or sort of a transitional shelter that probably will stay there for a very long time? It's not really the right environment for us to really start that healing process. And unfortunately, more often than not, this is the slide that I wanted to show. Almost 90% globally of people that get displaced because of a disaster or get out of their homes because their homes have been damaged, very, very few actually make it back to that same site where they are, where they used to live, and only a very lucky few move from an emergency shelter on site and really are able to rebuild a home, rebuild a building in that site. This is from UNHCR. It's very striking because this is as of 2020, so it does not take into account the last 2 years, and it doesn't take into account the 12 million people that were displaced since the Ukraine war started. Most of these refugees and IDPs, where do they end up? They end up in cities where urbanization is often 10 times the capacity to plan of cities, the capacity to design spaces, including public spaces and landscapes, and allow them to be actually absorbed and allow the newcomers to be absorbed and to be part of the new society. So how can we place then ourselves as a practice, the architectural and constructive act, because building has such a powerful meaning in these circumstances, at the center of these populations' movement and at the center of the reconstruction whenever that is happening. The day following the crisis, not 100 days later, not 3-5 years later, which is generally what happens, unfortunately. So in the aftermath of a crisis, the emergency response and humanitarian aid is very important. I'm not saying that it's not, and it's very critical. But depending on the environment in which we are in, it can take over certain decisions, and particularly those relating to space, and those have long-lasting impacts. And so we talk a lot about building back safer, better, more resilient, without the disaster's presence, without honoring the trauma that had happened already. But also it uses the benchmark of the pre-disaster condition as what we need to go back to, without taking into account certain vulnerabilities and certain elements that society has moved on from. And those are the only kind of possible scenarios of recovery. And the spectrum of these benchmarks that we are using often is moved depending not necessarily on what has been happening or what the reality on the ground is, but what is coming from outside, from humanitarian organizations, development organizations, donors that are giving money for a specific project and want to see something that looks specifically a certain way. And so where does the kind of the constructive act as a representative of the culture of society happen? We're not clear yet, and the architects do not have a lot of space to explore that, particularly local architects. There is a need for speed, efficiency, very limited time to think about the long term generally, which is something, by the way, the development actors who think a little bit about planning and longer term impacts of development really try to counter by creating what we call the humanitarian development nexus. And there's a lot of research and practice around this from international development that could potentially be brought into the architectural practice and be teased out a little bit. But what this means, this focus on efficiency, we understand where it is coming from. When we think about the hierarchy of needs, you all know the triangle, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The bottom part is the shelter, because we only need the 4 walls and a roof to be sheltered. And then when you look at the self-actualization, that's where design happens, that's where the culture happens, that's where creativity happens. But the architecture encompasses all of the triangle. It doesn't happen just in the self-actualization part. And within the shelter, there is an ability for architecture to happen to capture the creativity, to capture the culture, and to capture the social changes and the norms that evolve. And so this kind of functionality consideration of the humanitarian actors and the development actors overshadows our work as architects, but also overshadows the longer term impacts of the disaster on the creation of space from the architectural practice. But then we see that a lot of people often never get 2 chances to rebuild, and often are pressed to do whatever is available. So to work with whatever is available. So depending on the context, things that we see often is things like kits, material banks. So the government establishes subsidies. There's a big hangar with specific types of material that you go pick up, and you can just patch up your house and build whatever you can build to kind of either survive the winter or survive till the next season or survive until the money comes. But we miss a couple of things. One is that specific crisis, the thing that you're trying to patch up, really triggers fundamental shifts within social and cultural values, and we don't really capture that in architecture. And it leads to changes in thinking about and practice in space. And these changes become apparent in the built production after disaster, and the architect's role is shaping that discourse, is being part of that conversation from day one. There's a wealth of research actually in anthropology, which I found very useful. So a lot of anthropologists would live for several months to years with specific communities and try to transcribe a little bit their practices of space after specific events. And that's something that has not trickled back to our architectural practice, and that didn't allow us to really think about it. So how can we reclaim as architects that space in this field of reconstruction? But in order to do that, we need to kind of be at the table, as I said, and that's really all what my talk is about, but also really be very specific about what is it that we do, how are we honoring memory, how are we honoring culture, and how are we helping preserve and grow tradition, create new spatial realities that really are cognizant of disasters and not necessarily just build back, and discuss that in our education, in our practice, in our designs, and discuss that in the mainstreaming of architectural practice. It's not just about beautiful designs at the end of the day. It's really about what that does to the creation of a new reality for people. So a good example for this, and I looked at history, it's very, very difficult to show that because there is a problem. It's not a causal relationship. You cannot say that this disaster happened, therefore we started doing this design, and now our society has changed. It's a very murky sort of environment. It's very, very delicate, and we can't really have that clear line between the events, between the trauma and the production. But there is a good historical case study that is in post-World War II in Japan. I really like this drawing, this picture. It's of the Ise Shrine. It's one of the most sacred shrines in Japan, and it's being rebuilt every 25 years. And the idea is really not the building itself. The building is ephemeral. It's the learning of doing, making the junctions, creating the exact specific parts of the buildings that are being taught every 25 years, generation after generation, for 1,000 years. The reason why I preface with this is because this is something that is very specific to the culture of this country that was tried during World War II to be embedded in the post-disaster reconstruction, in the post-war reconstruction, in very different forms. So they took the conceptual elements of their culture, and instead of building the shapes exactly the same, they really tried to include them in what looks to us like modernist buildings, and you'll see later. But essentially, this is what Hiroshima looked like, and you probably all are familiar with this picture. There was a massive destruction that left whole cities razed to the grounds. And the effects of the war on the disposition of the architects to think about their identity, about their skill set, their role in the reconstruction and in society in general, led to a really long research that stretched over over like 15 years, essentially. And it really impacted the way these architects have produced buildings, have produced designs, and have really produced part of the Japanese culture as we know it. And we know famous architects now, that Japanese architects that come from this kind of type of thinking. A little bit of background, right before this, right before the end of the war, as you know, Japan was expanding in essentially most of Asia, Mongolia, Manchuria, Taiwan, Korea, which allowed the architects to escape a little bit some of the issues that were within the country. Lack of space, land use problems, seismic risks, societal problems between different kind of hierarchical groups. So in the pre-war era, they went outside. They went outside of the country and they explored, and they used their colonial parts of the world as a lab, as an experiment for modernism. But then when they came back, when they lost the war and they had to reckon with, one, the horrors of all of that they've done elsewhere, but then really reckon with the disaster and the damage that has happened in their country. What they realize is that a lot of the learnings and all of the cool designs that they've made in Manchuria and in Taiwan really do not apply in Japan. There is no space. There is no material. There's a lack of acceptance of a lot of the modernist type of work that was potentially being able to be imposed on other people. They couldn't impose it on themselves and on their country. So from that emerged a new brand of architecture that is uniquely Japanese, because they merged between what ISE stands for and what the modernism that was mainstream all over the world at the time. USSR, I live in DC. All of Southwest is like a pure modernist prototype. Like you walk there, you think you're in the 40s. It's amazing. And it's the same as well in a lot of different parts of the world. And the Japanese were not able to do that in their home country, even if they were provided with the tabula rasa, because they had to reckon with what Japanese people were living with at the time. And so the good example is, this is the Nagakin Tower. I'm sure a lot of you know it. It's a famous building. It's held to be the example of the metabolism movement. It's small apartments with each encapsulating really what a Japanese person could possibly use as living in a central Tokyo location. But the metabolism movement and what all of the architects, there were a group of architects that really were exploring how to merge modernity and tradition. They were launched officially, they became famous in 1960, so 15 years after the end of the war. But the roots of the work that the architects have produced in that World Expo in 1960 that launched them to the rest of the world really came from all of the work that they have done in the 15 years, cleaning up, building, designing cities, designing buildings, being accepted, being rejected, having to deal with heavy regulations, having to deal with lack of money or availability thereof, and really taught them how to make an architecture that is purely Japanese, that is distinctive, and that departs from the modernist movements elsewhere. And so to me, that is a really good example, because really shaped what the architectural practice in Japan is up until today. Like this is another picture that I always find very chilling. This is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. So it is on the site that has the Peace Memorial. And this is the picture that was taken by the architect. His name is Kenzo Tange. And as you see, he's building with the tombstones right in front of the site of his museum. So there's a lot of things that, while the museum is rising, he is really thinking of this juxtaposition between the past, between the horrors of what had happened in Hiroshima and what he is trying to represent in that museum itself. This is what the museum looks like now. It's finished. It's one of the beautiful examples, in my opinion, of modernist architecture, but particularly a Japanese, with a Japanese influence. And to bring it from the city level to the building level to a small detail. This is in Hiroshima again. This is an example that I really like. Unfortunately, my slide is cut down, but I want you to take a look at the difference in material under the columns. So this is just as a reference, this is a building by Kisho Kurokawa, who was one of Kenzo Tange's disciples, who was working in the post-war reconstruction, but who built the Hiroshima Contemporary Art Museum. And this is, to me, a perfect example of how architecture can be used as to sediment the memory, to really kind of embed what has happened within a continuum of societal change and evolution. So there are two types of granite. There's the lighter granite and the darker granite. The darker granite is from a radioactive quarry that changed the color of the granite, and the other one is from the quarry a few miles away that was not really affected. But the way the architect really thought about this specific detail and juxtaposing the two really reflects how you can build a building that looks totally normal by today's standard. There's an agora, kind of a reminder of the atomic bomb, according to the architect's words himself. But even at the level of the detail of the building, the thinking and the knowledge of the material, the local material, and embedding it within their design is really a good example of how memory can play an intricate role in recreating patterns that show how a traumatic event is part of our history, our collective history as a society, but that we move on from it. So I think it's really a beautiful example. I'm going to move to another example quickly. I'm cognizant of the time. This is Haiti, so this is 65 years later on the other side of the world. I just thought about it yesterday again in a conversation with Lindsay here, but there was an earthquake in 2010, biggest earthquake recorded in 200 years in that area, and then the epicenter was really near the center, the capital. So over 300,000 people that died. Many issues were really underlying already in the country. So there's lack of governance, problems of kind of persistent fragility all the way from the French colonialism era. But really, the very sad part is that there was an overtaking by the international community of how the rehabilitation and how the rebuilding was happening. The money came from outside, the knowledge came from outside, and there was very little space for people who know the country, who know the culture, to really have an input on how the built space looks like. These are some of the shelter designs that were proposed. A lot of them were financed by major donors, international ones. You go back to Haiti right now, there's nothing really there that could show you that there is an actual thinking about what the urban space looks like or what the built space should look like. In contrast, again, this is Chile. I don't know if you recognize this. This is from Elemental, so Aravena, who won the Pritzker Prize a couple of years ago. This is really famous, but to me what's very interesting is that Chile, in the same year, had exactly a similar earthquake, similar levels of destruction, very different realities from a governance perspective, from the presence of local people and local architects that really mounted up a little bit an intervention that helped the government, helped the local government, and helped people. But what Aravena did and what Elemental did here, this is just the final product. The final product is essentially like an almost A-frame type house with half being built, the other half being left to evolve as the families wish so. So depending on your situation, you have 3 kids, 4 kids, no kids at all, you really design the rest of your house as you wish, depending on where the money comes. But what they did before that, this is in Constitution, is that the Elemental team sat down with the local government and helped them think about a strategy of urban recovery and reconstruction. Very little is actually talked about. A lot of people talk about this, but what this is really the final product of 3 years of work upstream to create that enabling environment for the architectural act to happen, which is really fantastic. For those who don't know the World Bank, it's an institution that came with the explicit mandate to do reconstruction after World War II. It had 44 nations at the beginning that came together to essentially help Europe rebuild itself. So that was the first kind of mandate. Now it expanded to all of the countries in the world. So all of the countries are part of the board of directors of the World Bank. And it moved a little bit from reconstruction to really thinking about essentially eradicating poverty and making sure that there is shared prosperity amongst everybody, which is a lot of it is economic kind of support to a lot of these countries. But what I'm personally doing is I'm part of a very small group at the bank that does disaster risk management and increasingly in conflict and post-conflict support and reconstruction to governments, to local governments, to really think about how to plan to rebuild homes, to rebuild infrastructure, to rebuild urban spaces, public spaces, and to rebuild roads, everything, and also kind of economies as well. So I want to talk about these 2 examples of recent work I was heavily involved in. And these two examples are by no means kind of perfect. They are very recent, so it's an ongoing work. But they really showcase the realities of post-conflict and post-disaster contexts. And there are shifting goalposts that happen and things that happen every day that kind of catch us by surprise almost. And it's very, very challenging to work on. But it's also extremely rewarding in the sense that you see a product that where the influence, where the decision-making was given to as much as possible to the people who really need to make that decision. So I'm going to start first with Lebanon. Again, I don't know how much you know this, but on August 4, 2020, over there, that's the port. There were silos. There was a massive explosion. The port is really near downtown, so it's across the street from downtown. The explosion happened. It killed over 200 people, displaced 300,000 people, and it destroyed homes, businesses, infrastructure, and disrupted economic activity. Beirut hosts half of the population of Lebanon. It hosts the majority of the economy of the country. So a blast like this doesn't really just demolish or destroy the built environment. It really demolishes and destroys a whole country and a whole economy. What we did very quickly the next day was to essentially an assessment of really how much has been destroyed, how much has been damaged, and what is the cost associated to rebuilding. We estimated it to be around $4.6 billion to rebuild around 5 square kilometers around the port. When this includes the port itself. And with housing, and again, a very, very important element for architects, and culture being the most severely affected. I mean, this comes as a background, this comes at the heels of COVID, but it also comes at the heel of a financial crisis that had been plaguing the country, but also a political deadlock. So a very difficult environment to really, for people, for practitioners, to be able to work on. Half of the sort of the landscape of Beirut, this kind of waterfront, is really high-end apartment buildings. So one of the first things that when we were trying to think about, okay, what do we do? The first thing that a lot of the owners of these areas said, well, we have to wait for the insurance to come back and tell us whether this was an act of God and we can get paid, or if it was not, and someone else needs to pay us before we do any rehabilitation. So automatically, a lot of these buildings that were really destroyed, including an Herzog et de Meuron building that is in downtown. I don't know if it was rehabilitated now. I haven't been back in a couple of months, but when I was there last, it was still damaged. Really were there sitting like ghosts in a downtown that was vibrant just a couple of months ago. So what we tried to do is to assess the damage, created a recovery framework where we had working groups that are still up until today collaborating on topics of housing, urban planning, service delivery, municipal work, heritage. This is just to name a few. And we tried to do some fundraising. And so we established this thing called the Lebanon Financing Facility, which essentially pools, brings together people. So instead of the USAID or the US wanting to finance one building and the Japanese wanting to finance two, and the Danish, we just pull them all together and say, okay, we're going to have an economy of scale in terms of the financing, but really a localized decision making. And then we designed a project that tried to respond to the critical needs on the ground, which are these beautiful buildings. So Beirut is also known for a rich historic, a rich heritage. Sorry, it dates back from the Phoenicians. Wherever you go in Beirut, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but there's archaeological digs that are absolutely amazing. Then layered on that, an Ottoman era period where buildings were in downtown are absolutely gorgeous historic buildings that need to be preserved. And then layered on that also Italian style, French style that were added and created this very rich urban scape that needed to be preserved. Incidentally, these buildings also really have huge tenure issues, old rent, so people with essentially rent control, where it was very difficult for people to to kind of monetize essentially rental. And also a lot of them have problems with inheritance disputes, etc. So it's a very complex kind of landscape to be able to work on. So we tried to kind of create a prioritization framework with academia, CSOs, and NGOs. And there are an amazing a wealth of those in Beirut, particularly. It was very impressive to really come up with prioritized lists of buildings that then these interventions could happen on based on the heritage value, based on who's living there in terms of vulnerability, and based on whether the people really want to have an intervention on their building essentially for free. So this is the before on your left. So this is a small street in a neighborhood called Rumayel, where it was also a blend of kind of a protectorate era and Ottoman era. And to the left is the kind of the end product. As you see, nothing fancy. It's not an amazing design, but really the devil is in the detail, because the stone cuts, the use of material, the use of the constructive culture, also particularly coming from Syrian refugees that knew how to work the wood inside, was really used. And then we added seismic resilience and flood management around it. EDL behind, still, unfortunately, still not being rehabilitated. That building behind is the electricity, essentially HQ, the electricity company HQ. And it really was one of the buildings that just completely received the blast in full force. And there are still buildings like this that are completely destroyed. This is my picture, and I had to write the number of the lot, because that's the only thing we know of this building, is just its number. So this is our next phase, is trying to grapple with these lots that have been completely damaged, but they are part of a fabric that is so old, that has a sedimentation of culture, that has a community there that needs to come back, but needs to come back to an affordable housing, to a housing that actually represents them. So that's just a very small example of an ongoing work that we have there. Then I want to talk about Ukraine. So we're all familiar with this crisis. It's still unfolding, as you know. So you know, Russians invaded Ukraine, casualties, lots of people died, lots of damage. Again, we did exactly the same thing immediately as soon as we could. One of the things that we did was help the government of Ukraine work on multiple fronts. So I want to touch on a couple of things that we did with them. One thing we did was quantify the damage, again, at the city level. And here I want to talk about this example. So this is the nightlight analysis, month to month from February to April, just to kind of better understand the level of, well, access to electricity, but also the level of damages to the buildings. And to us, it's very important, because this is one of the ways, if you don't have access to the ground, you use all of the possible data. You have to get creative about really seeing and visualizing where damage gets. So that's one of the things we did. Make sure that digital records are available. We kept them, we made them available, and we're working with the government to really update them on an ongoing basis. I focused on housing and culture again, and it has been a very interesting learning experience for me. And then the second element that we did with them is really starting to help the government again think from a Marshall Plan type strategy to really how to do it on the ground. And here's where it gets very interesting. So this is one of like the zooms that we did. We used a lot of work on satellite imagery. This is a Kharkiv apartment building. It's very interesting to have these conversations at this early stage with government and decision makers, including ministries of finance, ministries of infrastructure, and people who ultimately are the ones that decide where the money goes and how the building happens. Understanding Ukraine's built history, understanding a little bit that kind of appreciation of the history of the country was very important, because during the assessment we have established that multi-family apartment buildings in Ukraine were the largest building typology in the whole country. So like essentially 90% or 88% of the population lives in apartment buildings and lives in these massive super blocks that were built in the USSR era. So, and particularly these buildings that are called the Khrushchevska buildings, and they are in super blocks. And it's very interesting because these buildings have a very loaded history, even within Ukraine, because under Khrushchev's era, there was this kind of push to kind of redeem the USSR in front of Ukraine after the famine. And so, and it was also very ideologically charged. Let's build a lot, let's build very minimally and very small so that the building itself and the apartment where the person lives reflects the kind of the aspirations and the ideals of the communist ideology. So essentially communism over capitalism. So smaller apartments, very, very minimal designs, very tight, super blocks because it's much cheaper to build and much faster. And that's a way to show Ukraine that Moscow cares about them, but also the fact that it allows sort of a kind of a supremacy over capitalism in a way. The problem with these is that these buildings are very old now. They never really were meant to be for such a long period of time. I think there was an understanding that people would evolve and that these buildings will be dismantled and be reused to something else. But 75 years later or 80 years later, they're still there. They are terribly energy inefficient. They are not seismically sound, and they carry that history. So the conversations we're having with the government is, okay, what do you want to do with these? Like, there's a super block that's half demolished. There's parts of the building that are there. What is it that you want to do? Will you rethink the layout of the city and rethink how people are living and include mixed use, rethink a little bit about an adaptive reuse of these super blocks so that you kind of move on from the history, or do you want to rebuild as is, to go back to the benchmark as it was before? I mean, as Ukraine also looks to join the EU, it subscribes to a new socio-political discourse. So question arises, what the reconstruction really would look like. But anyway, regardless, development and agreement on this reconstruction strategy, whatever it looks like, is going to be very important because of the limited public resources. Defining the priorities is very important. And all of this sometimes tends to be done from an economic perspective, from a financial perspective. Very seldom is it done from really a design and a social perspective. And I think that's where our role, all of us in this room, comes in, and comes in very handy. I'm not going to talk a lot about Ukraine because it's kind of sad and we don't really know what's happening. But it's definitely something that we're engaged in on a very, very close basis. But to sum up really again, architecture and the design act and the choice of material, the choice of form, the space making are never really divorced from the realities, the social realities, the geopolitics, the social and economic constraints, local governance, finance, all of these things play a really, really important role. But then they are even more important after a disaster because in a globalized world, you do a design, it may work in Singapore, it may work in Cape Town or Santiago de Chile. Great. After a disaster, would that work? I'm not so sure, and I don't think it should. So how we internalize also as local architects and as practitioners, how we internalize that appreciation of the evolution of people is very important. I think I'm going to stop here. I'd love to continue talking about this. Obviously, I have lots of thoughts about it, but I think it would be great to kind of hear your thoughts. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. There you go.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I mean, it's really amazing to be able to see actually this perspective of the reality and for all of the broad perspective that you brought in. From the audience, do you guys have any questions? Yes.
I'm not sure I need the microphone, but I'd be glad to take it.
Sure.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you. I guess one hears about the World Bank off and on, but it's not like it makes, the media.
very much in terms of what it is and what it does. I have a two-part question. First, you're involved in the disaster end of things. Am I correct in observing that the World Bank is involved in much more than disaster relief? Okay, with that in mind, is it possible for you to tell us approximately what percentage of the World Bank's work is disaster focused? I'm just curious because this is really amazing what you're sharing with us here.
Thank you for this. It's a really good question. So, after the reconstruction of Europe, so France and Germany were the first, essentially, World Bank beneficiaries. We actually have not done a lot of reconstruction. We did it after natural hazards a lot. So I think maybe 80% of my time and my team's time we dedicate to disasters. But we are a very small team compared to the rest of the World Bank. The rest of the World Bank does a lot of macroeconomics, so a lot of support to governments to have governments that don't have disasters, to have a sort of a development-focused kind of reforms, ensuring that there is stability in their fiscal kind of ceilings, that there is investments in key areas such as education, health, environment, transport. We do a lot of financing competitive and small and medium enterprises as well. So it's a really, really big institution. We have offices essentially in almost all of the countries in the world, and we're over 10,000 employees just, I think, in the DC office. So it's a really big institution, but more and more what I find is that with disasters, our first entry point is really talking about reconstruction. And then from that, the economy discussions happen. From that, development and long-term goals for ending poverty and shared prosperity come in. But it's really not the only thing we do. It's a really, really big institution. I could make a presentation. I might not be the best person to actually talk about it because it's mostly economists, and I'm one of the very, very few architects that actually work there. So it's a really, really huge, huge institution that does different things.
You touched upon natural disasters just now. You related the impacts of earthquakes. But most of what you've shown us today is human-born, human-caused disaster. Has that been growing? Or perhaps another way to look at that, is the World Bank finding that there is much more destruction that is human-born rather than natural disasters such as flooding, earthquakes?
So I touched on Aceh and on Haiti, and both are natural hazard caused disasters. And both there was a big intervention and the damage was really massive. One recent one that we just had to grapple with is the floods in Pakistan. And that's, again, we had similar engagement where we're really trying to advise the government how can you advise a government to build something for an event that no one has ever expected to happen, because it's so out of the way, and that's something we really have to deal with. But actually, over the past maybe 30 years, we've done more post-disaster reconstruction than we've done post-conflict. But in the past 10 years, we're shifting a little bit more because we're having to intervene in spaces where there is fragility, where there's conflict, and where there's violence. Because that's where the majority of poverty is. That's where a lot of the refugees end up being displaced from. And so that's just a very important element for us to start engaging in. And the reason why I chose these two, honestly, is because both a lot of disasters, so floods, for example, the Pakistan flood, didn't really touch much urban areas. So a lot of the damage was on rural farmhouses and a lot of it on the agricultural land. What's relevant to me is really the urban areas, you know? And with conflicts, you always find that urban areas are the ones that are targeted most and they're the ones that are damaged most. And so that thinking needs to happen there more so than in disasters, with the exception of, massive disasters like Aceh, like the earthquake and tsunami in Chile, like the Haiti earthquake. They had an impact on both, but conflicts particularly, they're vicious in that sense because they really, really touch the cities and they touch the built environment. You destroy the assets, no? Because it's an economic asset. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. You mentioned something which was interesting. You talked about when the people are when people relocate, it's hard for them to go back. So I'm just thinking about the reconstruction. Is it focused on the place? So if people leave a place, like from Uganda, and we have so many countries around it that people, refugees come to, and people are generous to give land, and people can stay there. So the question is, the reconstruction, is it where the people are, or where you want people to go back to? So just
There is no simple response to that, because it's very, very dependent. So in the Uganda case, for instance, there is a lot of programming that is done from a social perspective of refugee and host community integration. So really thinking about planning cities and planning services so that there is less conflict between these two groups of people. But ultimately, when it is such an acute event and a conflict, and you're really, for your own sovereignty as a country, you want to rebuild, you ought to really thinking about what can you rebuild so that you incentivize people to come back. Because, and Uganda is a great example, but even just thinking about, it's not a very sustainable kind of way of looking at things, because these refugees at some point, they're going to be reaching a point where they have to go back because maybe a government will change and the new government will say, no, we don't want refugees anymore. If there is any crisis, refugees probably are going to be blamed, So to preempt all of this, we really need to think about the space that is destroyed and make decisions about it, either to build somewhere else and really think about refugees or internally displaced people as the owners and solve the HLP rights, the housing, land and property rights there, or incentivize people to go back by really creating a space that actually speaks to these people, both from an economy perspective, from social perspective, sects and tribes and groups that need to be together, need to be taken into account, and that's the localized response. But it's really, I don't think there's anybody so far that has done a refugee response that looks exactly like the next one, because it's really dependent on the context. Back to again, Lebanon and Jordan have received a lot of refugees from Iraq and Syria. And right now there's a lot of push for refugees to leave 10 years after, And you never know how these things change. But a refugee always has much, much lesser rights than someone who is from that part. So a reconstruction or construction of spaces that host these communities needs to always be accompanied by a lot of social and economic support, both from integration perspective, job creation, availing opportunity, and that's really at a much higher level.
I saw a project in, I don't know if the architect was from Ukraine or if they're from somewhere in the Balkans, but basically it was a re-envisioning of when people return to this typology specifically of buildings that have been demolished. It was some sort of system where they had like like a structure on the outside, and then they had like prefab modular things, almost like a metabolistic aspect, where they were able to basically plug them in, if that makes sense. And I'm not really sure. That opens the larger question. To what extent would it be smarter to keep what you have versus just tearing everything down and rebuilding? Because I know that some of these, you worry about the integrity of the foundation and the structure and all of those things. So I don't know which would be smarter. I mean, again, I guess it depends too on the situation.
That's a very good point. There's a lot of architectural projects that I've seen over the years that toyed a little bit with the modularity question, because it's easy. It responds to that need we have of efficiency and scaling up. If you can make one module, you can just prefabricate it and send it over, and you'll solve the housing issue very quickly. But then in the long term, really, is that really a good solution or not? That remains to be seen. It could potentially be a solution, but it just can't be the only one that's out there and that prevails. And you're right. It's very much a localized decision when it comes to deciding whether you tear down a super block, or if it is not structurally unsafe, do you think about an adaptive reuse? Do you just rehouse people as they were before? It has to come from that specific area, not from anybody that would decide from elsewhere, and certainly not, again, from someone who would think of it just from an efficiency perspective. Sorry.
I have a question that I've been trying to formulate for like a couple minutes, so I apologize in advance if it's a little rambling. But World Bank inherently isn't exactly like apolitical because of the way that it's like voting works and how certain powers hold more votes, or certain nations hold more votes. So how do you see that affecting the way that aid or reconstruction is distributed to countries that may have conflicts with some of the voting powers, and how does reconstruction still remain equitable and egalitarian in conflicts that are not apolitical, specifically things like acts of war versus natural disasters, which I think I would imagine maybe easier to rally behind, like rebuilding after an act of God, than something that is a political conflict?
Now, that's a very good question. Yeah, we do like to call ourselves apolitical, but only to a certain extent, because there is an executive board of directors that responds to clusters of countries, and there are, as you said, countries that are more powerful than others. But overall, what I've seen so far is that, with the exception of countries where there was like an intentional break of the relationships, and these are three: North Korea, Syria, and Iran. So these are where there is like they don't have a seat anymore at the table. So Syria, since the 2012, I think. North Korea, honestly, I have no idea since when. Those are the only countries where we do not have any engagement, and yet we do a lot of monitoring for Syria, for instance. So like one of the pictures I actually showed is from Aleppo. We do yearly assessments of the damage, and we feed it to the international community because it's a public good. So there is a part of it where, yes, maybe we can't do investments because it is a bank, it is a financing mechanism. You make money available for projects. We may not do that, but we do a lot of ideation, public good projects, which are data, assessments, analysis. So we do that, for instance, every year in Syria. We share it with the UN because they do have boots on the ground and they can help people. And they take advantage of the fact that we do have resources to really carry these very detailed analytics on specific sectors that can really be useful on the ground. And then really opening the dialogue for the international community, because we do that convening of power that is beyond what the political willingness is. So that's on the political side. Surprisingly, like in the Ukraine case, Russia is a fairly powerful executive director office compared to Ukraine, but still, there's a rallying around that just says, no, this is a humanitarian crisis, that's what we're going to do. So yes and no, in the sense that I could see how, for instance, in the case of Syria, Iran, and North Korea, there is no real engagement because they are not within the kind of the bounds of our engagement with them. But beyond that, we really try to be as apolitical as possible, especially when it comes to analytics and like the thinking and the support. The investment is another story. You know, it goes through other hoops. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is, knowing that the severity and frequency of natural disasters is only increasing due to climate change, and we know it's more likely to affect urban areas than in the past, is a lot of what you've discussed has been reactive and reconstruction effort to disasters that have already happened. In parallel, are there efforts for climate resiliency going on through the World Bank?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. It's actually, this is part of my job. The other part is disaster management. So really activity work. So what we do is essentially at different levels, working with the national governments to think about roles and responsibilities to reduce risks of specific natural hazards, impacts on infrastructure, services, and specific vulnerable communities. And then at the local level, and particularly in cities, try to think about planning in a way that recognizes disaster risk and climate change as well. So things like heat waves now is a big topic that we really try to mainstream in our investments. So if you are a city and you are in an area that has that is subject to heat wave, you're planning, we can help you with the investments necessary for that. That's a with early warning systems and strengthening the hydrometeorological knowledge and casting communication population leave early if there is a disaster happening in retrofitting. So Turkey, the by job of all this is risk. The reason why I like to it's really very little on this topic, you know, and it's really worth discussing. And I feel like the architectural forum that the fora we have as architects need to kind of put this a little bit more on the forefront, especially. And so we make everything resilient. And then also in parallel, fragility and conflict in the world is on the rise. So again, another reason why from a global perspective, this is an important topic to talk about. But yeah, I can do a whole other presentation about kind of the cycle of disaster risk management and what we can do about it.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating presentation. It was really, really interesting to see how you went from your early designs to this current work, and that was what my question was meant to be. This how about the role of architectural thinking and an architect and design thinking that you mentioned several times in these kind of situations, and in being able to read reality in a way that we are not used to think of when we think about architecture, right? We never teach in our architecture schools about how to dismantle buildings or how to rearrange buildings. We always teach about how to building it from a blank slate many times. So how do you see that, or do you feel, and Kyle mentioned that briefly talking about natural disasters and climate disasters, How do you think that the future of the architectural profession should be a little bit more like you and a little bit less than, should be trying to understand these complex situations, these effects that are embedded in reality, rather than just trying to rethink whole new realities? And have you experienced that kind of transition from being a designer and an architectural researcher into this?
It's a very difficult question. So let me kind of break it down a little bit. So the first part really is about whether whether the architect, whether the transition, like whether the education of architecture needs to shift to think about potential risks. For me, that is not necessarily the case. It doesn't need to make the shift. It just needs to create that space as in addition to all of the learning that we have already. My best inputs compared to all of my colleagues that have very varied, they do political science, they do a lot of economy, finance. I really am not the smartest person in the room when I'm with them, because they really know so many different things. But there are certain things that they have no idea how to really appreciate, which is just what it takes to design a building and what it takes to actually build it. So going through that construction cycle, what it takes to actually make BOQs and follow up in the construction site and make sure that the details are well cared for, that the building is safe, that all of that knowledge that we acquire as practitioners lacks a lot in when we talk about this from a higher level. By the time it trickles down to the practitioners, when it comes to executing, it's already too late. And that's the point. From the education perspective, I feel like embedding certain notions that the architecture is not just purely the design from a tabula rasa, but that there are certain realities around us that may not be a disaster, but there are realities that we need to try to understand through the built space is really very important, because that is what will then save us in a way and create a space for us to talk about it when the disaster happens, because we have that constructive memory and we have the cultural memory as well. And the anthropologists do have that, but they don't have the design background. The economists do have the kind of the understanding of the quantity from a macro level of what needs to be done, but they don't have neither the social nor the design background. And architects seem to have that integrator ability, you know? And that integration is a quality that needs to be a little bit more put forward in my field. I think architects are needed in normal conditions. I think it's very important. But really just having that kind of presence whenever there is discussion around disaster risk or around reconstruction, to really have that confidence to say, no, actually architects know how to do that, you know. I feel like that's very important. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is going to be about the reconstruction process, because you've been discussing the input of the culture while you are basically showing the images about the reconstruction. I was wondering about how you are creating that bond or the collaboration with the people who are like suffering from these disasters, because I think it's not that easy to have that culture back. So I was wondering about the process, how you reinstate that culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, and it's again a very fraught process. It's almost, think of it almost as a, you know, the peace building process, you know, where there is a lot of kind of a lot of collaboration that needs to happen, and I think in smaller scales, like in Beirut, what we managed to do is to create a sort of a working group or a consortium of sorts of representatives of different trades. I have to say, it's an amazing environment because there are universities that have the cutting edge knowledge, that have done a lot of surveys, that have done a lot of work and thinking about the urban space, particularly in Beirut. But there's also an order of engineers and architects that has lots of motivation. And despite the fact that the government is in transition and they are struggling, that kind of bringing those people together and saying, okay, we're going to think about, for me, I'm going to think about the prioritization of how many buildings and what are the qualities that we need to bring back together. I give you a straw man. It's your responsibility as that working group to tell me whether I'm wrong or not, because ultimately that is theirs. And it's really that back and forth. So think of it as more sort of like a collaborative design process. It takes much longer. It's less, it's much faster to just kind of just bring prefabs and put something quickly, right? But that collaborative process and really bringing the right people to the table is very important. And again, it's not always easy. You don't always find the right people, but when you do, it really is important to have them or build the capacity so that they can do it, you know? Hope that helps.